The first serious attempt to decode the Voynich manuscript came from none other than Romaine Newbold, a professor of philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania and one of America's leading medieval scholars. In 1919, Newbold announced that he had successfully cracked the manuscript's code and made a discovery that would revolutionize our understanding of medieval science. According to Newbold's analysis, the Voynich manuscript had been written by Roger Bacon, a 13th-century Franciscan friar and philosopher known for his advanced ideas about experimental science. Newbold claimed that Bacon had used a complex cipher to hide revolutionary scientific discoveries, including detailed observations made through powerful microscopes and telescopes, devices that weren't supposed to have been invented until centuries later. Newbold's translation suggested that Bacon had observed cellular structures in plants, spiral nebulae in distant galaxies, and even the structure of individual atoms. If true, this would mean that medieval scholars had achieved scientific breakthroughs that wouldn't be replicated until the modern era. The academic world was stunned. Newbold's credentials were impeccable, and his methodology appeared sound. He published his findings in scholarly journals and gave lectures at major universities, presenting what seemed to be conclusive evidence that the Voynich manuscript contained lost scientific knowledge from the Middle Ages. But other scholars began to examine Newbold's work more closely, and cracks started to appear in his theory. Cryptographers pointed out that his decoding method was so flexible that it could be used to derive almost any meaning from the text. When they applied Newbold's technique to random passages, they could produce equally convincing translations that described completely different scientific observations. More damaging still, medieval historians demonstrated that many of Newbold's alleged discoveries were inconsistent with what was known about Roger Bacon's life and work. The manuscript's illustrations didn't match Bacon's documented interests, and the writing style was completely different from Bacon's authenticated texts. By 1928, Newbold's theory had been thoroughly debunked by the academic community. The professor himself died in 1926, never living to see his life's work completely discredited. But his failure to decode the Voynich manuscript only added to its mystique, proving that even brilliant scholars with decades of experience could be completely wrong about what the text contained. The next major attempt came during World War II, when the manuscript attracted the attention of military codebreakers who were used to cracking the most sophisticated enemy encryption systems. If anyone could decode an ancient cipher, it would be the experts who were regularly breaking German and Japanese codes that had been created using the most advanced cryptographic techniques available. But even the military's best codebreakers were stumped by the Voynich manuscript. They applied every decryption technique in their arsenal, using both human analysis and early computational methods, but the text refused to yield its secrets. The patterns they could identify suggested that it was indeed a real language rather than random nonsense, but it didn't correspond to any known linguistic family or writing system. One of the military analysts, Captain Prescott Currier, made a particularly disturbing discovery. He found evidence that the manuscript might actually contain two different languages or dialects, written by at least two different scribes. This suggested that the Voynich manuscript wasn't the work of a single isolated scholar creating an artificial language, but rather evidence of an entire unknown culture with its own sophisticated writing system. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, a steady stream of amateur and professional cryptographers took their shots at the manuscript. Each new attempt brought fresh theories and methodologies, but none produced a convincing translation. Some researchers focused on statistical analysis of the text, looking for patterns that might reveal underlying linguistic structures. Others concentrated on the illustrations, hoping that understanding the images might provide clues to the meaning of the text. A few scholars proposed that the manuscript might not be a cipher at all, but rather written in a natural language that had since become extinct. This theory suggested that the Voynich manuscript might be the last surviving example of a medieval European language that had disappeared without leaving any other traces. But even this explanation had problems. Linguists pointed out that languages don't simply vanish without leaving any influence on neighboring tongues or any other written records. If the Voynich manuscript was written in a natural language, where were the other examples of that language? Where were the people who spoke it, and why had no other traces of their culture survived? As the decades passed and each new attempt at decoding failed, the Voynich manuscript began to seem less like a challenging puzzle and more like an impossible mystery. The text appeared to follow natural language patterns, but it didn't match any known human communication system. It was as if someone had taken a perfectly ordinary book and somehow transformed it into something that human minds simply couldn't process.